No power greater than X.
What's up, everybody? Welcome to the 5th episode of the Crossroads, celebrating 20 years of the Xbox brand. My name is Ryan Turford, and this is the show where we're counting down the months to the 20-year anniversary of the original Xbox with 50 of the best games to play on the console for both new and experienced owners. We dive into the brief history of each game and talk about what makes them awesome. As always, we'd love your feedback on this and all of our shows over on Twitter at the Xbox Drive, or you can reach out to me directly anytime at Ryan Turford. Now, the Tomb Raider series, as y'all known, it's been around for a very long time, basically since the late 90s. 1996 was the very first year that we got a Tomb Raider game in just Tomb Raider. And the series itself has been a huge hit ever since. I mean, Lara Croft has been a gaming icon pretty much ever since the first game came out. So, I mean, people have really latched onto Lara as a character very quickly, and to the point where, I mean, we had 2 Tomb Raider movies come out even before the game that we're going to talk about today came out in 2006, if you can believe it. So, again, Lara was literally all over the place. She was in magazines, like non-gaming magazines. She was in like commercials for perfume and stuff. Like, she was all over the place. So it was kind of crazy to see kind of all that tumble down after 2003's The Angel of Darkness, which was on PS2 and PC. And it really had like a really troubled development cycle. It was delayed a whole bunch of times. It was actually supposed to come out a year and a half before it actually did. And it ended up actually coming out a month after Tomb Raider 2, the movie, Tomb Raider: The Cradle of Life. And it was kind of crazy to see the collapse of it, because they wanted to do something super ambitious with it, because they wanted to give you this open world version of Paris. Because you have to remember, this was also in development after Grand Theft Auto 3 came out, which kind of changed the landscape for a lot of games, because a lot of games wanted to push in that open world direction after Grand Theft Auto 3, but it was really just that over ambition that kind of killed the game. And unfortunately, pretty much spelled the end for core Designs actually handling the Tomb Raider series going forward. It wasn't until 2006 that we finally got today's game, which is Tomb Raider Legends, which actually was handed off to Crystal Dynamics in 2004. That's when they began production on this game. And this was actually their first kick of the can. I mean, a lot of people know Crystal Dynamics as the company now that does Tomb Raider. And they've been doing Tomb Raider for a while now. And most people know Crystal Dynamics specifically from the Tomb Raider reboots. However, Crystal Dynamics was actually a really well-established publisher even before Legend came out in 2006, because they were better known for a lot of the Legacy of Kain games, specifically the 2 Soul Reaver games, as well as pretty much all of the Legacy of Kain games that came out after Soul Reaver, essentially. So they were actually a big developer when this came out. They also did Gex, the Gecko as well. Before actually hopping onto Tomb Raider. They were given basically the mandate from Eidos, because this was before the Square Enix buyout of Eidos Interactive, where they wanted to basically reboot everything about Tomb Raider, not just the story, but they actually wanted Crystal Dynamics to basically reboot everything from the combat, the traversal, everything about this game was going to be very different from the previous games in the Tomb Raider series. And honestly, I think Crystal did an amazing job with this game. But of course, I'm going to tell you why right now. In case you haven't played it, in Tomb Raider Legends, you play as Lara Croft as she searches for an artifact that could be linked to her mother's disappearance when she was a child. She tracks this artifact down to Bolivia. However, she runs into mercenaries along the way who actually end up stealing the artifact before she has a chance to get there. However, she only finds that it's only one piece of the artifact that's been stolen. Lara then travels across the globe to try and find the remaining pieces before they get stolen in various tombs and locations, while fighting this mercenary band that's basically also trying to track down these artifacts for mysterious reasons. And again, the Tomb Raider series itself has always been kind of like Indiana Jones in a way, where it's rooted in reality, but also rooted in mysticism and myth, and having some weird stuff going on. And again, there's this whole supernatural thing that happens to Lara's mother very early in the game that, again, just kind of links all these events together. And I thought it was actually really cool that they decided to actually delve more into Lara's family's past, because we actually didn't see too much of that in the original Tomb Raider games. You saw snippets of it and kind of little things in when exploring Croft Manor, or little things throughout some of the other stories, but you didn't really have like a very personal story for Laura. And this was really the first game that we really had that really felt like it was Laura's a really personal Laura story, rather than being like almost like her trying to stop, some big thing from happening. So I thought it was actually a really interesting direction that Crystal Dynamics took the story in. While the story was never really a huge focus for older core design Tomb Raider titles, Crystal made it a very large priority this time around, and it totally shows. While the story in Legend won't certainly blow your socks off and is more your standard action movie fare, it does a great job reintroducing us to Laura, while also retaining some of the events from older games as canon as a tribute to Core Design's original philosophy. It naturally felt like it slotted in with the previous games, and if you didn't know it was a reboot, you'd probably think it was just a continuation of the series going forward. Plus, the events in Legends set up an overarching narrative that would be part of both its sequel in Tomb Raider Underworld, as well as Crystal's remake of the original Tomb Raider game. And it wasn't, the remake of the original Tomb Raider, aka Tomb Raider Anniversary, wasn't just a retelling of the same exact story. They put some of the other elements from Legend's overarching storyline into Anniversary, which honestly, I think it made it feel a lot more of a special game. So honestly, Legend's story, yes, it's not amazing or anything like that, but it kicked off this great trilogy of Tomb Raider games that, again, I don't know if it's as strong as the modern Tomb Raider games from Crystal. I do think it's actually pretty strong for games at this fair, especially on the original Xbox. You didn't see too many third-person shooters that really focused on story, or even focused a lot on exploration, like in the game, the same way as this did. So I really appreciated that Crystal really put the time and effort into the story and really developed it to be more than just what we saw in the previous games. The area of Legend that actually saw the biggest overhaul, however, besides the story, was the movement tech found in the game. Gone are the tank controls from the original games, and now you can freely move Laura in the same way as you would be able to in other third-person action games. While Laura has always been an acrobatic character, in Legend, Crystal decided to add some dodge mechanics as well as the ability to perform somersaults so you could show off a little bit when avoiding some traps. You also had the addition of a grappling hook, which could be used over specific large pits. Laura also was able to climb sections a lot faster by timing the Y button with some of your movements, allowing the climbing to feel a little less like a chore than it did in previous entries of the series. You're actually able to move pretty quickly throughout the environments in this game, which I thought was super sweet. All of this really boiled down to Laura actually controlling way better than in any of the previous Tomb Raider games. Again, the previous Tomb Raider games were basically tank controls like Resident Evil, but in a 3D space rather than like a top down or isometric view like in Resident Evil, or fixed camera angles, I should say. Whereas you had freeform with the camera, but you basically like had to turn Laura and then push forward to make her go. And just everything about the movement tech felt so much more refreshing when you played this game. And it just really highlights how much of an acrobatic character that Laura is, because you never really thought about it that way until you saw it on display in this game. And it was really cool to see Crystal go in that direction. Although the one thing I will say that is kind of a minus looking back on it, this game retroactively with the movement stuff, is there are a lot of QuickTime events in this game as well. Again, QuickTime events after Resident Evil 4 had come out were kind of all the rage back in 2006. So it made sense for them to go in that direction at the time. And everyone was all about QuickTime events at that time, even though a lot of people like me kind of hated them. And they're very much on display in this game. So if you're going to go back and revisit this one, just keep that in mind, because that's going to be a thing you have to deal with. Combat, on the other hand, though, was a bit disappointing, as lots of encounters had you just locking onto your enemy of choice as you run circles around them while spamming the right trigger with your weapon of choice. It was certainly the one aspect that Crystal got much better as the series went on, but they did a good job in Legends spacing out the combat and giving you lots of puzzles, motorcycle chases scenes, and traversal to break up the monotony of combat. Speaking of the puzzles, they were actually really well done in Legend, striking the right balance between difficulty and frustration levels. There were also one or two physics-based puzzles that became a bit frustrating, but overall, most weren't actually too complicated, and they were actually pretty satisfying to solve. And the puzzle solving itself, not too complex, not too simple. Again, it's nothing rivaling the tombs you could find in the later Tomb Raider games, but at the same time, it wasn't too easy either. And I actually liked just how it broke up all of the action with the puzzles. And they did a really good job of game balance in this game, more than anything. And honestly, I think that for my money, even though the combat itself just felt very similar to the old games, and that was actually the closest thing I think that it kind of resembled the old games with, where it was mostly just kind of mindless, but at the same time, like the combat was not the focus this time. It was mostly just traversing the environments, and the puzzles were really just 80% of the game, which for me, I thought was actually pretty sweet. And when I compare it to the modern Tomb Raider trilogy, I would almost compare it more to something like Shadow of the Tomb Raider, because Shadow of the Tomb Raider is more like that, where there is combat in that game, but it's definitely not the focus of that game. That game is more focused on the exploration elements, and that's kind of how I felt about Tomb Raider Legend revisiting it. Now, if you're looking to pick up Tomb Raider Legend today, it's not backwards compatible on Xbox 360. However, there is an Xbox 360 version of the game if you have a 360. However, we should really talk about real quick about the 360 version, because honestly, they're both pretty much the same game. Like, as far as content-wise, they're exactly the same. But other than some updating lighting and a little bit of visual polish, for the most part, they're pretty much the same game, which is the main reason why I actually chose Tomb Raider Legend for this list. Because normally, you might think to yourself, well, this is more of a 360 game. Why are you picking it for the original Xbox list? But ultimately, I think that when you're looking at the best games on the original Xbox, I would be remiss not to talk about Tomb Raider Legend, because I do think it is a very fun game. It still really holds up both visually and gameplay wise. It still feels great to play today. And more so visually, honestly, the environments look great. The character models look great. Whether you're playing it on the original Xbox version or the 360 version. So regardless of, the only reason really to play the 360 version is A, if you want achievements, or B, if you only have a 360 and not the original Xbox. Otherwise, honestly, you can't go wrong with either one, because both are great. So regardless of where you play it, Tomb Raider Legends is a fantastic game. And if you've never played it, if you've never gone back and played the original Crystal Dynamics trilogy with this Anniversary and Underworld, I would highly recommend it, especially if you are a Tomb Raider fan. They're very different from the new Tomb Raider games. They are much more linear, because you don't have that open world that you kind of have in the newer Tomb Raider titles. But ultimately, if you're okay with that, play these games. They're great, and they're definitely worth checking out. That's all for this episode of The Crossroads. You can hit me up on Twitter anytime at Ryan Turford. You can also find the Pantsman himself on Twitter at Sean Capri, or us on Twitter at The Xbox Drive. Thanks so much for watching or listening to this episode of The Crossroads, and we out. Bye.